The alarm screamed through every corridor of Fortress 7, and Daniel Walsh felt his stomach drop before his mind caught up with what that particular sound meant. He pushed away from his desk where he'd been reviewing security protocols and ran toward the command center. Other personnel rushed past him, faces tight with fear. Daniel had seen emergencies before during his 2 years stationed on this massive orbital platform, but this alarm was different. This was the one that made veteran aliens go pale. Ambassador Lyra stood frozen in the command center, her feathered crest flat against her head in obvious distress. Around her, holographic displays flickered with incoming reports. Daniel slowed as he entered, taking in the chaos of voices speaking over each other in a dozen different languages. Confirmed. Sighting at mining colony Sierra 9. Someone shouted, all ships ordered to evacuate immediately. Another voice cut in. High Commander Brunt, whose scaled green skin usually gleamed with confidence, looked older somehow as he studied the main display. Daniel moved closer to see what had caused this panic. The screen showed a distant video feed from the mining colony, grainy and shaking. Through the static, he could make out something massive moving between asteroids. It was hard to judge scale, but when one of the colony's transport ships came into frame for comparison, Daniel understood why the room felt like a tomb. The thing dwarfed the ship. It moved with purpose, almost graceful despite its size. Dark armor covered its body in overlapping plates. Multiple limbs gripped the asteroid surfaces as it pulled itself forward. Even through the poor quality feed, Daniel could see rows of sensory organs along its head, and the way its tail swept through space like a weapon. A silence bringer, Lyra whispered beside him. She'd moved closer without him noticing. After 40 years of peace, another one appears. Daniel had heard the name before in casual conversations, always spoken with hushed tones. He'd assumed it was exaggeration, the way soldiers tell ghost stories to scare new recruits. Looking at the creature now, he realized the stories hadn't done it justice. We need fleet mobilization immediately, Commander Brunt said, his voice steady despite the tension in his shoulders. 17 settlements destroyed across 4 centuries. We cannot allow another. We can't fight that, someone else argued. Every military engagement has ended in catastrophic losses. The debate erupted around the room. Daniel stood quietly, watching the feed loop as the creature moved through the asteroid field. It paused occasionally, turning its massive head as if searching for something. The mining colony had already evacuated based on the empty platforms visible in the background. Smart. Whatever this thing was, humanity's weapons would barely scratch something that size. What about the humans? A voice called out. Daniel realized others had noticed him standing there. Your species always has creative solutions. He felt multiple eyes turned toward him. Daniel cleared his throat. I'd need to know more about it first. What do we know about its behavior? Commander Brunt snorted a wet sound from his reptilian throat. It appears. It destroys, it leaves. That is all we need to know. But Ambassador Lyra tilted her head, her crest rising slightly with interest. Dr. Grant is in the Xenobiology Division. Perhaps she could brief Lieutenant Walsh on what little we've recorded over the centuries. The meeting continued for another hour, but Daniel found himself distracted. He kept watching the feed, studying how the creature moved. Something nagged at the back of his mind, a familiarity he couldn't quite place. When the gathering finally broke apart, with no clear decision beyond monitoring and preparing evacuation routes for nearby colonies, Daniel made his way to the research wing. Dr. Sophie Grant looked like she hadn't slept. Her dark hair was pulled back messily, and her desk overflowed with data tablets and holographic projections. She glanced up when Daniel entered. Let me guess, Sophie said. They sent you to see if humans have some magic solution. Something like that. Daniel pulled up a chair. What can you tell me about this thing? Sophie sighed and began pulling up files. Images of the creature from different encounters over centuries filled the space between them. Some were clearer than others, but all showed the same massive predator. It's solitary as far as we can tell. Appears every few decades in different systems. Territorial and extremely aggressive. The subsonic frequencies it emits cause most species to experience overwhelming fear responses. Physical combat is nearly impossible because of its armor and size. Weapons that can damage it require firepower that would also destroy whatever we're trying to protect. Daniel leaned forward, studying an image that showed the creature's full body profile. 6 limbs, sensory organs clustered around its head region, a long tail that seemed both flexible and powerful. Has anyone tried communicating with it? Tried and failed. Most first contact protocols assume some level of technology or recognizable intelligence signals. This thing doesn't use tools, doesn't respond to mathematical sequences or basic symbolic gestures. It just roars and attacks. Sophie paused. Why do you ask? Because it moves like an animal, not a monster. Daniel pointed to one image showing the creature gripping an asteroid. See the way it positions its limbs? That's efficient movement, not random. And here, the way its head turns to track that ship. It's aware of its surroundings, calculating. Sophie frowned. Most apex predators are aware and calculating. That doesn't make them less dangerous. No, Daniel agreed. But it means they follow patterns, instincts, behaviors. He thought back to his years before joining the coalition. The time spent in conservation zones on Earth working with animals that could kill him without effort. On Earth, we lived alongside creatures like this for millions of years. Not this big maybe, but the same kind of predator. We learned how they think, how they react, what triggers them. And? Sophie prompted. Daniel looked at the frozen image of the silence bringer, its mouth open mid-roar. I think everyone's been looking at this wrong. You're treating it like an invading army. But what if it's just an animal defending something it considers its territory? Sophie stared at him for a long moment. Then she began typing rapidly, pulling up new data. The sightings. Every single confirmed encounter over 400 years. Let me overlay them with resource-rich regions and unclaimed territories. The map populated with red dots marking silence-bringer appearances. After a moment, patterns emerged. They always appear in asteroid fields or nebula regions with rare minerals or energy signatures. Places that would attract mining operations. Places worth defending, Daniel said quietly. He stood up, adrenaline starting to pump through his veins. I need to present this to the council. We might not have to fight it at all. They'll never listen, Sophie warned. Too many species have lost people to these creatures. They want revenge, not understanding. Daniel headed toward the door. Then I'll have to make them understand. Because if this thing is what I think it is, we're not dealing with a monster. We're dealing with something my species actually knows how to handle. Behind him, Sophie called out, And what's that? Daniel looked back. An apex predator protecting its home. 3 days of arguments had left Daniel exhausted, but he refused to give up. He stood in the strategy chamber again, surrounded by holographic displays showing every recorded encounter with silence bringers throughout history. Chief Strategist Orwin clicked his mandibles thoughtfully. His insectoid features difficult to read, but his body language suggesting genuine interest. That made one supporter at least. You're asking us to believe, Commander Bront said slowly, his clawed hand gesturing at the displays, that these creatures which have killed thousands of our people across centuries are simply misunderstood animals. Not misunderstood, Daniel corrected. Just not what you think they are. Look at the behavior patterns. He pulled up a video from 80 years ago. This one appeared when a scaled assembly fleet began mining operations in the outer drift. It didn't attack immediately. It circled the area for 3 days first. Then it roared. That roar, the subsonic frequency Dr. Grant measured, it matches territorial warning calls from Earth predators. Ambassador Lyra's crest feathers rippled with uncertainty, but it did attack. 12 ships were destroyed. After they ignored the warning and continued mining, Daniel pointed out. After they fired on it first, he moved to another recording. Here, a colony on the edge of Feathered Crest space. The silence bringer appeared, displayed aggression, but when the colony evacuated within 2 days, it never pursued. It stayed in the asteroid field they'd left behind. Orwin leaned forward. I see the pattern Lieutenant Walsh describes. The question becomes whether this pattern indicates intelligence we can reason with or simply instinct we cannot overcome. Daniel felt frustration building. How could he explain something that felt so obvious to him? He thought back to his time on Earth, to moments that had shaped his understanding. When I was 23, I worked at a conservation zone in what used to be called North America. We had a grizzly bear, massive male, over 800 pounds. He'd wandered into human territory because a drought had driven him from his usual range. Captain Helen Brooks, another human in the room, raised an eyebrow. Getting to a point, Walsh? The local government wanted to kill it. Dangerous predator, they said. Too risky to relocate. But we studied its behavior first. Found out it was defending a berry patch that had survived the drought. We marked the territory, kept humans out, and the bear never bothered anyone. Lived another 12 years. Daniel looked around the room. That's what I mean. Understanding behavior instead of just reacting to danger. A bear is not a creature that can destroy spacecraft. Commander Bront growled. No, but the principle is the same. You see a threat. I see an animal following its instincts. Daniel pulled up Dr. Grant's analysis. Sophie's research shows something important. Most coalition species evolved as prey animals or herd animals. Your predators were either pack hunters or ambush hunters. Very few species had solitary apex predators, and those that did eliminated them early in your development. Ambassador Lyra nodded slowly. The feathered crest evolved from small tree dwellers. Our predators hunted in groups or struck from hiding. We survived by fleeing or by superior numbers. The scaled assembly's predators were sea creatures, Bront admitted grudgingly. We moved to land to escape them. By the time we returned to the oceans with technology, they were no longer a threat. Humans are different, Daniel continued. We lived alongside apex predators for millions of years. Bears, big cats, crocodiles, wolves. We learned their patterns, their signals, their boundaries. We learned when to fight, when to flee, and when to simply show respect and keep our distance. It's built into our psychology. Orwin's mandibles clicked rapidly. This is why humans have such elaborate body language around dominance and submission. I have observed this in human interactions but never understood the evolutionary pressure behind it. Exactly. Daniel felt a spark of hope. When two apex predators meet in nature, they don't always fight. Fighting risks injury for both, so they have displays, rituals, ways of establishing dominance or showing submission without bloodshed. The Silence Bringer's roar isn't mindless rage. It's a warning. Back off or face consequences. So what do you propose? Captain Brooks asked. We can't just let it claim whatever territory it wants. That asteroid field has resources 3 colonies need. Daniel took a breath. This was the hard part. I propose we approach it. Not with weapons, not with demands, but with respect. Show we understand it's claiming territory. See if we can establish boundaries it will accept. The room erupted. Several voices shouted over each other, most arguing against the idea. Commander Bront's voice cut through the noise. Absolutely not. Every species that has attempted peaceful contact has lost people. You're proposing suicide. I'm proposing we try something that hasn't been attempted before, Daniel said firmly. No one has approached a silence bringer with understanding of predator behavior. You've all treated it like an enemy to be defeated or a disaster to flee from. What if we treat it like what it is? A territorial animal that can be reasoned with, not through words but through actions it understands. Ambassador Lyra stood, and the room quieted out of respect for her position. Lieutenant Walsh, you truly believe this could work? Daniel met her eyes. I believe we haven't tried the right approach yet, and I believe humans have knowledge that could make the difference. Knowledge purchased through millions of years of being prey ourselves, Brooks muttered, but she didn't sound entirely opposed. Exactly, Daniel said. We know what it's like to be hunted. We know what it's like to face something bigger and stronger, and we learned how to survive not just by becoming stronger, but by becoming smarter about understanding what we faced. Orwin clicked his mandibles again. I support giving this approach one attempt. The traditional methods have failed repeatedly. Perhaps an unconventional solution is precisely what this situation requires. The debate continued for hours. Daniel found himself answering questions about Earth predators, about human evolution, about specific incidents where humans had successfully dealt with dangerous animals. Some members of the council seemed genuinely interested. Others remained skeptical. Commander Bront never wavered in his opposition, but even he couldn't deny that military solutions had proven ineffective in the past. Finally, as the station's artificial day cycle approached its end, Ambassador Lyra called for a vote. The decision was close, but it passed. Daniel would get his chance. One attempt to make peaceful contact with the Silence Bringer before the coalition committed to either evacuation or military action. As the council dispersed, Dr. Grant approached him. You actually convinced them. I didn't think it was possible. Now comes the hard part, Daniel said, feeling the weight of what he'd agreed to. I have to actually do it. Sophie handed him a data tablet. I've prepared everything I know about the creature's biology and behavior patterns. Its sensory capabilities, the frequency ranges it responds to, structural analysis of its armor. Everything that might help you survive this. Survive, Daniel repeated. Not ideal phrasing. I'm a scientist, not a motivational speaker. But Sophie's expression softened. For what it's worth, I think you might be right. I've been studying the footage since our conversation. There are patterns there. Communication attempts, maybe. Territory markers. The behavior is complex, not random. Daniel nodded, studying the tablet. They had 48 hours to prepare before his attempt. 48 hours to figure out how to approach one of the most dangerous creatures in known space and convince it not to kill him. He thought again of that grizzly bear, how it had watched him from across the berry patch that day, two apex predators acknowledging each other. Finding a way to coexist, let's get to work, he said. I need to learn everything about how this creature communicates. And I need to figure out how to tell it that I'm not a threat to its territory without actually speaking. Sophie smiled despite the tension. Just like dealing with Earth predators? Just like that, Daniel agreed. Except this time I can't bring a tranquilizer gun as backup. The shuttle felt too small and too exposed at the same time. Daniel sat in the passenger section, watching through the viewport as Fortress 7 grew smaller behind them. Iris, the feathered crest pilot, kept her hands steady on the controls, but her crest feathers lay completely flat against her skull. That was fear. Dr. Grant sat across from him, eyes fixed on the scanning equipment she'd brought. Chief Strategist Orwin occupied the fourth seat, observing everything with his multifaceted eyes. Subsonic readings are already elevated, Sophie reported, her voice tight. The creature knows we're approaching. Good, Daniel said, though his own heart was racing. That means it's paying attention. Iris made a sound that might have been a laugh or a sob. Paying attention is what gets ships destroyed, Lieutenant. Not this time. Daniel tried to sound more confident than he felt. Remember the flight plan. Slow approach, no aggressive maneuvers, no weapons active. We're not a threat. The asteroid field came into view, a tumbling collection of rocks ranging from boulder-sized to small moon-sized. The Silence Bringer had claimed this entire region, driving out the mining colony that had been operating here for 6 months. Between the larger asteroids, Daniel could see the creature moving. Even at this distance, its size was staggering. Orwin clicked his mandibles softly. Remarkable. I have seen the recordings, but witnessing it directly is quite different. The creature stopped moving, its massive head turned toward their shuttle. Daniel felt something wash over him, a pressure that seemed to reach inside his chest and squeeze. The subsonic roar. Sophie had warned him about this. Most species found it overwhelming, triggering deep-seated prey responses that millions of years of evolution had hardwired into their brains. Iris whimpered. Her hands shook on the controls. I can't do this. Every instinct is screaming at me to run. I know, Daniel said gently, but you can fight it. Just hold position. You don't have to go closer. Just stay right here. The creature roared again, and this time Daniel heard it through the shuttle's hull even though they were in the vacuum of space. The sound traveled through the structure itself, making everything vibrate. Sophie grabbed her seat armrests, knuckles white. Orwin went completely still, his species' version of panic. Daniel unbuckled his harness and moved to the pilot's seat beside Iris. Look at me. Not at the creature. At me. She slowly turned her head, eyes wide with terror. You're doing great. We're still here. We're alive. That's already better than any previous encounter. It's going to charge us, Iris whispered. Maybe, but it hasn't yet. Daniel studied the creature through the viewport. It had stopped its roar and now simply watched them, waiting. Sophie, what are the subsonic readings now? Still elevated but not increasing. It's holding steady. Sophie checked her instruments again. That's unusual. In previous encounters, the readings spiked continuously until the creature attacked. Daniel nodded slowly. Because we're not advancing. We're not threatening. He pointed at the cluster of larger asteroids beyond where the creature waited. Sophie, can you scan those asteroids? The ones it seems to be positioning itself in front of? Sophie worked her equipment while keeping her eyes averted from the direct view of the creature. After a moment, she made a surprised sound. There's an energy signature. Geothermal, I think. But in a pattern that suggests artificial structure. Not naturally occurring. Or eggs, Daniel said quietly. Nest sites, the pieces fell into place. This wasn't random territory. This was a breeding ground. Daniel thought of nesting birds attacking anything that came near, of mother bears defending cubs, of crocodiles guarding egg clutches. The behavior made perfect sense now. It's protecting young, he said. That's why it's so aggressive here. Orwin shifted in his seat. If true, that makes it more dangerous, not less. Yes and no. Daniel watched the creature. It hadn't moved closer, but it hadn't backed away either. It means there's no compromise on this location. We can't mine here, but it also means the behavior is predictable. Defensive, not offensive, he made a decision. Iris, kill the engines. Just hold position with maneuvering thrusters only. What? Why? To show we're not advancing. We're acknowledging its boundary. Daniel returned to his seat and began putting on his EVA suit. The others stared at him. You're not, Sophie said flatly. I have to. Daniel sealed the suit's chest piece. The shuttle is still a threat. It's big, it's powered, it could attack. But me, alone in space? I'm tiny, vulnerable, no threat at all. You'll also be unprotected, Orwin pointed out, though his tone suggested he understood the logic. That's the point. Daniel checked the suit's seals, testing the gloves. Every predator encounter I had on Earth required the same calculation. How do I show I'm not a threat? Sometimes that means making yourself small, quiet, non-aggressive. Sometimes it means showing you understand the boundaries. Sophie grabbed his arm. Daniel, this isn't Earth, this isn't a bear or a lion. If you're wrong about this creature's behavior, there's no second chance. He met her eyes. If I'm wrong, the alternative is war. Military engagement that will cost hundreds of lives and probably still fail. Or we abandon resource-rich territory because we're too afraid to try understanding what we're dealing with. I have to try. The airlock cycle took 30 seconds but felt like hours. Then Daniel was floating in open space, the shuttle behind him. The asteroid field ahead and the silence bringer directly in front. Truly alone now. The creature had gone still, watching him. Daniel activated his maneuvering jets, pushing himself slowly away from the shuttle. Making himself separate. Making himself vulnerable. He thought of every dangerous animal he'd ever faced. Every moment where his life depended on reading behavior correctly. The grizzly that charged but stopped 10 feet away, testing his nerve. The lioness that circled his vehicle for 20 minutes, deciding if he was prey or something else. The massive saltwater crocodile that watched him from the river, calculating whether he was worth the effort. All of them had a language. Not words, but actions, posture, position, presence. The silence bringer moved. Daniel forced himself to remain still as it pushed off from the asteroid it had been gripping and floated toward him. Up close, it was beyond massive. One of its limbs was larger than the entire shuttle. Its armor plates overlapped like shields scarred from centuries of life. Multiple eyes focused on him, each one the size of his entire helmet. Then it roared. The sound hit Daniel like a physical force even through the vacuum. His suit's sensors screamed warnings. The vibration traveled through his body, rattling his bones. He understood completely why most species fled in terror. Every human instinct shouted at him to return to the safety of the shuttle. But Daniel had felt fear before. He'd stood his ground before. He kept his body relaxed, his posture open, his movements minimal. He maintained eye contact with the central pair of eyes but didn't challenge. Just acknowledged. The creature circled him. Daniel slowly rotated his body to keep facing it, not following with just his eyes, showing engagement, respect, awareness. The creature's tail swept past, close enough that Daniel could see the intricate patterns on its armor. It rumbled, a different sound. Lower frequency. Testing, questioning. Daniel thought of the moment he'd lowered his head to the grizzly, the universal gesture of submission without defeat. He slowly tilted his helmeted head down, breaking direct eye contact. Not fleeing, not cowering, just acknowledging dominance, acknowledging territory, acknowledging right of place. The creature went silent. For several heartbeats, nothing happened. Then Daniel felt something touch his helmet. He looked up slowly. One of the creature's limbs extended toward him, the end splitting into fine manipulators that touched his faceplate with surprising delicacy. Testing, learning, understanding that he was alive, aware, intelligent. Daniel remained still, barely breathing. The creature pulled back, then moved past him toward the shuttle. Sophie's voice crackled in his ear, tight with panic. Daniel, it's approaching us. Don't move, he said. Don't do anything. Let it investigate. He watched as the creature examined the shuttle with the same careful attention it had given him. It touched the hull, circled the vessel, studied the viewport where Iris, Sophie, and Orwin watched in frozen terror. Then it returned to Daniel, floating in space between him and its nesting ground. Another rumble. Daniel understood. He activated his suit jets, moving slowly away from the asteroid field. Backing up while still facing the creature, showing retreat, showing respect for the boundary. The creature watched but didn't follow. Daniel reached the shuttle and pulled himself inside. The moment the airlock sealed, Iris hit the thrusters, backing them away from the asteroid field at a steady pace, not fleeing, not attacking. Just leaving, as Daniel had shown. The creature returned to its position in front of the nesting asteroids. As they retreated, it roared one final time. But the tone was different. Not aggressive, not threatening. A statement, a declaration. This is my territory. You have acknowledged it. We understand each other. It worked, Sophie whispered. It actually worked. Daniel watched through the viewport as the creature grew smaller with distance. It lowered its defenses when I lowered mine. Not because it feared me, because it recognized I was showing respect. Orwin clicked his mandibles rapidly. The Coalition needs to understand this. Everything needs to change about how we view these creatures. As Fortress 7 came back into view, Daniel felt exhaustion settling into his bones. But beneath that, satisfaction. He'd been right. The Silence Bringer wasn't a monster. It was simply a parent protecting its young, responding to the behavior patterns it understood. And now, for the first time in centuries, a human had spoken its language. News of Daniel's success spread through the Coalition faster than he'd expected. Within hours of returning to Fortress 7, he found himself in meeting after meeting, explaining what had happened, answering questions, defending his interpretation of events. Some believed him immediately. Others remained skeptical, insisting he'd simply gotten lucky. Commander Brandt fell firmly into the latter category. One encounter proves nothing, the Scaled Assembly leader argued during an emergency council session. For all we know, that particular creature was ill or weakened. The historical record shows consistent aggression across centuries. Daniel, still exhausted from the ordeal, struggled to keep his voice level. The historical record shows consistent defensive behavior when territory is threatened. Look at the data Dr. Grant compiled. Every attack followed either invasion of claimed space or hostile action by Coalition forces. Ambassador Lyra studied the holographic displays Sophie had prepared. They showed overlapping maps of Silence Bringer sightings, territorial markers, and conflict incidents. The pattern is compelling, but Commander Brandt raises a valid concern. Can we truly base policy on a single successful contact? We base military policy on consistent failures, Orwin pointed out. Multiple attempts at armed conflict have resulted in losses without successfully removing a single Silence Bringer from contested territory. Lieutenant Walsh's approach succeeded where traditional methods have not. The debate stretched on for hours. Daniel found himself describing the encounter repeatedly, each time trying to convey the creature's body language, the meaning behind its movements, the intelligence he'd seen in its eyes. Some council members understood. Others couldn't see past their fear. Finally, a compromise was reached. The asteroid field would be designated a protected zone. Mining operations would not resume. In exchange, the Coalition would establish clear boundary markers using the subsonic frequencies Sophie had identified as non-threatening. If the Silence Bringer respected those boundaries, it would support Daniel's theory. If it didn't, military options would be back on the table. Daniel left the council chamber feeling hollow. A protected zone was better than war, but he'd hoped for more, understanding rather than just avoidance. As he walked through Fortress 7's corridors, he noticed how other species now looked at him. Some with curiosity, some with respect, but many with confusion, as if he'd done something incomprehensible. Sophie found him in the observation deck staring out at the stars. You did good today, did I? We're still treating it like a problem to be managed, not a life form to be understood. That's more than we had before. Sophie joined him at the viewport. You showed them something they couldn't conceive of, that these creatures aren't forces of nature or monsters from nightmares. They're animals following instincts, and those instincts can be understood. Daniel thought about the moment the Silence Bringer had touched his helmet, the gentleness in that gesture. The curiosity. It was sapient, Sophie. I don't know if it has technology or civilization, but that creature was thinking, evaluating, making decisions. When it looked at me, I saw recognition, like it understood I was trying to communicate. That's going to be a harder sell than just predator behavior, Sophie warned. Sapience means rights, protections, political complications. It also means possibility. Daniel turned to face her. What if there's a whole species of these beings out there? What if they've been avoiding us because every encounter ended in violence? What if we just made first contact without realizing it? The implications of that statement hung in the air. First contact protocols were established coalition policy. If the Silence Bringers were truly sapient, everything changed. They weren't pests to be removed or hazards to be avoided. They were potential members of the galactic community. Over the following weeks, Daniel worked with Sophie and Orwin to establish the boundary markers. They used drones to place beacons around the asteroid field, each broadcasting the subsonic patterns Sophie had identified as neutral. The Silence Bringer watched from a distance but didn't interfere. When the work was complete, Daniel insisted on one final visit. He took a solo pod this time, just a one-person craft meant for short-range observation. Iris refused to pilot again. Her trauma from the first encounter still too fresh. Daniel couldn't blame her, but he needed to see if the creature remembered him, if the connection had been real or imagined. He approached the boundary markers slowly, broadcasting his approach through subsonic frequencies. The Silence Bringer emerged from the asteroid field, moving to meet him. Daniel stopped his pod outside the marked boundary, powering down to minimal life support. Waiting. The creature approached the nearest beacon, examining it with apparent interest. It touched the device with its delicate manipulators, then released a subsonic pulse of its own. Different from its roar, softer. Questioning, maybe? Daniel activated his pod's external speakers, broadcasting a similar soft pulse. The creature's head turned toward him. It moved closer, stopping just short of the boundary marker. Then it did something that made Daniel's breath catch. It lowered its massive head, a clear, deliberate motion. The same gesture Daniel had made during their first encounter. Recognition, acknowledgement, understanding. Daniel felt tears in his eyes. He'd been right. The creature remembered. It understood what the boundaries meant. More than that, it was showing the same respect Daniel had shown it. Two intelligent beings finding a way to coexist. He returned the gesture, lowering his head inside his pod, knowing the creature could see him through the viewport. When he looked up again, the Silence Bringer was already moving back toward its nesting ground. The conversation, such as it was, had been completed. Boundaries established. Respect given and received. Daniel returned to Fortress 7 with video evidence of the exchange. This time, even Commander Bront couldn't dismiss the implications. The Silence Bringer's deliberate mimicry of Daniel's gesture suggested learning, memory, and communication ability. The Coalition Council called another emergency session. Professor Richard Lee, one of Earth's leading xenobiologists, joined via communication link from Earth. His weathered face filled the holographic display as he reviewed the footage. Remarkable. We've long theorized that intelligence can evolve through multiple pathways, but this is the first confirmed case of apex predator sapience developing without technology use. The Silence Bringers may represent a form of intelligence focused entirely on environmental awareness and behavioral communication. What does this mean for coalition policy? Ambassador Lyra asked. Professor Lee considered carefully. It means you're dealing with first contact. All the protocols apply. These beings have intelligence, memory, and communication ability. They're not animals in the traditional sense. They're people, just very different people. The word hung in the air. People. Not creatures. Not monsters. People. Commander Bront's scales rippled with agitation. This is absurd. They have no technology, no civilization, no culture we can recognize. They have territory, family units, and social behavior. Daniel countered. They communicate through subsonic frequencies and body language. They remember encounters and learn from them. What part of that doesn't qualify as culture? The part where they've killed thousands of coalition citizens, Bront snapped. In defense of their territory and young, Daniel shot back. Every species in this coalition has done the same at some point in their history. We judge ourselves by our intentions, but others by their actions. That's not fair and it's not right. Professor Lee nodded approvingly. Lieutenant Walsh understands something crucial. Humanity's long coexistence with apex predators taught us that intelligence comes in many forms. We learned to recognize consciousness in beings that didn't build cities or use tools. The Silence Bringers deserve that same recognition. The debate continued for days. Coalition law was complex, built on centuries of precedent. Adding a non-technological sapient species to the protected persons list required unanimous consent. Every species had to agree. Some did immediately, others needed convincing. Commander Bront and the Scaled Assembly were the last holdouts. Finally, a breakthrough came from an unexpected source. A young Scaled Assembly scientist named Vera presented research showing that the Scaled Assembly's own apex predators, hunted to extinction 10,000 years ago, had shown similar behavioral patterns. The creatures the Scaled Assembly had destroyed might have been sapient too, and that knowledge shook Bront's certainty. "We may have destroyed people because we were too afraid to understand them," Vera said quietly. "Let us not make the same mistake twice." The vote passed. The Silence Bringers were officially recognized as sapient beings under Coalition protection. Their territories would be respected. Further study would be conducted, but always with consent and respect. Daniel felt a weight lift from his shoulders. That night, he stood again at the observation deck looking toward the protected zone. Somewhere in that asteroid field, a parent creature guarded its young, unaware that everything had just changed. Unaware that it and its kind were no longer seen as monsters but as neighbors in a vast and complicated galaxy. Sophie joined him again. "Feeling proud?" "Feeling hopeful," Daniel replied. This was one creature, one encounter, one success. But it proved something important. That fear isn't inevitable. That understanding is possible. That we can be better than our instincts if we try. "Very human of you," Sophie said with a smile. Daniel laughed. "Maybe. But I think every species in the Coalition is capable of it. We just had to show them how. 5 years changed everything and nothing at the same time." Daniel stood in his new office aboard Fortress 7, looking at the title engraved on his desk, Director of Interspecies Relations. The position hadn't existed before his encounter with the Silence Bringer. Now it was considered essential to Coalition operations. His job was to bridge the gap between species that had evolved along such different paths that they struggled to understand each other's most basic behaviors. The office walls displayed updates from across Coalition space. 12 Silence Bringers had been documented in the past 5 years, each in its own protected territory. Some were solitary, like the first one Daniel had met. Others appeared to form loose associations, their territories bordering each other in ways that suggested communication or at least mutual awareness. Sophie's team, now officially the Apex Studies program, was learning more every month. But today's emergency pulled Daniel away from routine reports. Another Silence Bringer had appeared, this time near a developing colony in the Outer Reach sector. Unlike previous encounters, this one had appeared suddenly, giving no warning time. The colony couldn't evacuate quickly and tensions were rising. Daniel pulled up the mission briefing. Lieutenant Peter Cole would lead the contact team. Young, eager, and trained in the protocols Daniel had developed over years of study, Peter had shadowed Daniel on 3 previous Silence Bringer contacts, each successful. But this would be his first time leading. Daniel would be there, but only as advisor. It was time to see if what he'd learned could truly be taught to others. The shuttle bay was busy with preparations. Peter stood near the contact vessel, reviewing checklists with his team. When he saw Daniel approaching, his face brightened. "Director Walsh, I wasn't sure you'd make it." "Wouldn't miss it." Daniel studied the young man. Peter had that combination of confidence and nerves that Daniel remembered from his own first encounter. "How are you feeling?" "Terrified and excited in equal measure." Peter laughed, but there was strain in it. "I know the protocols. I understand the behavior patterns. But actually facing one of them? That's different than simulations." "Very different," Daniel agreed. "The fear is real, Peter. It's biological. Every instinct will tell you to run. The key is acknowledging that fear while not letting it control your actions." "Easy for you to say. You're human. You evolved alongside these kinds of predators." Daniel shook his head. "I'm human, which means my ancestors spent millions of years running from things like this. The fear is just as strong for me. I've just had practice working through it." The team assembled. Besides Peter, there was Sophie, now a senior researcher, and 2 new additions. One was a feathered crest behavioral specialist named River, who had overcome her species' instinctive terror through years of exposure therapy. The other was Winston, a scaled assembly observer sent by Commander Bront, who had grudgingly admitted that the Silence-Bringer situation required expertise his people didn't possess. The flight to the outer reach sector took 6 hours. During that time, Sophie briefed them on what little was known about this particular Silence-Bringer. It had appeared 3 days ago, claiming an asteroid cluster near a developing agricultural colony. The colonists had halted expansion immediately and called for help, avoiding the mistakes of earlier generations. That was progress. The territory it's claiming is larger than usual, Sophie noted, pulling up holographic maps, nearly twice the size of documented nesting grounds. That could mean several things. Larger species variation, multiple young, or something else we haven't encountered yet. River's crest feathers rippled nervously, or it could simply be more aggressive than others. Possible, Daniel admitted. But the pattern holds across all documented cases. Larger territory usually means more to protect. We approach with the same caution and respect as always. As they approached the asteroid cluster, Daniel felt the familiar weight of anticipation. Even after 5 years and multiple successful contacts, approaching a Silence-Bringer never became routine. Each was an individual with its own temperament and history. Each required careful reading and response. The creature appeared between 2 large asteroids, and even Daniel felt his breath catch. This one was massive, easily 50% larger than any previously documented. Its armor was darker, almost black, and covered in deep scars that spoke of age and experience. When it roared, the subsonic pulse was so powerful that several warning alarms triggered in the shuttle. Winston made a sound of pure terror. Even through his scaled assembly armor, he was shaking. This was a mistake. We should return with military support. No, Peter said, his voice steadier than Daniel expected. Look at its positioning. It's between us and those asteroids. Defensive posture, just like the protocols describe. Daniel felt pride watching Peter analyze the situation. The young man was right. Despite the creature's size and the intensity of its roar, it was displaying classic territorial defense behavior. Good observation. Sophie, what are the subsonic patterns telling us? Warning calls, same as other encounters. But there's something else. Sophie adjusted her instruments. Multiple frequency layers, like it's broadcasting several messages at once. It's not alone, River said suddenly, her sharp eyes catching movement behind the creature. There's another one. Daniel leaned forward, watching as a second Silence-Bringer emerged from the asteroid cluster. Smaller, maybe only 2/3 the size of the first. Younger, different sex? They had no way of knowing, but the 2 creatures moved in coordination, the larger one maintaining its position while the smaller one circled behind their territory. Mated pair, Sophie whispered. We've theorized they might form bonds, but this is the first confirmation. The implications raced through Daniel's mind. 2 creatures meant more complex social behavior. It meant these beings weren't just solitary territorial animals. They formed relationships, partnerships, another piece of evidence for sapience beyond what they'd already established. Peter, Daniel said quietly, how do we proceed? The young lieutenant took a breath, working through the decision tree they'd practiced. We hold position. We broadcast non-threatening frequencies. We wait for them to assess us rather than forcing the encounter. If the larger one approaches, I suit up and meet it on equal terms, showing I understand the boundaries they're establishing. Good. Daniel nodded. Remember, you're not just an individual human. You're representing all of us. How you act will tell them whether we're trustworthy or not. Peter implemented the plan carefully. The shuttle powered down to minimal systems, broadcasting Sophie's neutral frequency patterns. The 2 Silence-Bringers watched them, communicating with each other through subsonic pulses too complex for the human equipment to fully translate. After what felt like hours but was only 20 minutes, the larger creature moved forward. That's my cue, Peter said, standing. His hands shook as he sealed his EVA suit, but his voice remained steady. Wish me luck. You don't need luck, Daniel told him. You have training and understanding. Trust that. Peter entered the airlock and Daniel watched through the external cameras as the young man floated out into space. The Silence-Bringer approached, its massive form dwarfing Peter even more than it had dwarfed Daniel years ago. Peter held position, body language open and non-threatening, just as Daniel had taught him. The creature circled Peter, examining him. Then it roared. The full force of its warning cry focused on this small human floating alone in space. Through the camera feed, Daniel could see Peter's suit readings spike, heart rate elevated, breathing rapid, stress hormones flooding his system. But he didn't flee. He stayed, enduring the test. Then Peter did what Daniel had done 5 years ago. He lowered his head, breaking eye contact, showing respect and acknowledgement of the creature's dominance in this space. The gesture was clear and deliberate. The silence bringer went silent. It moved closer, reaching out with its delicate manipulators to touch Peter's helmet. Investigating. Learning. Then it pulled back and, in a motion that made everyone in the shuttle gasp, it lowered its own massive head in response. It worked, River breathed. It actually worked for him too. Daniel smiled, relief and pride mixing together. Peter had done it. The connection wasn't unique to Daniel. It was reproducible. The principles of predator behavior and mutual respect transcended individual humans. This was confirmation that what Daniel had discovered could be taught, shared, and used by others. Peter slowly retrieved a boundary beacon from his suit and placed it in space, marking the edge of respect. The silence bringer watched but didn't interfere. Then Peter began his careful retreat, backing away while maintaining awareness of the creature. It let him go, returning to join its partner near the asteroid cluster. Back in the shuttle, Peter removed his helmet with shaking hands. That was the most terrifying and amazing experience of my life. You did perfectly, Daniel told him. Better than perfectly. You trusted the protocols and your training. Winston, the scaled assembly observer, was silent for a long moment. Then he spoke quietly. I understand now what you have been trying to teach us all these years. It is not about controlling fear or pretending bravery. It is about understanding that fear and acting correctly despite it. Exactly, Daniel said. Fear is natural. It keeps us alive. But understanding allows us to act appropriately even when we're afraid. As they returned to Fortress 7, Daniel thought about how far they'd come. 5 years ago, he'd been one human with a theory and a hope. Now there were trained specialists across multiple species learning to bridge the gap between predator and prey psychology. The Apex Studies program was expanding, not just studying silence bringers, but examining how different evolutionary paths created different ways of seeing the universe. Sophie pulled up her latest research findings. We've identified 3 more species in coalition space that show similar patterns to silence bringers. Solitary, territorial, highly intelligent, but non-technological. They've been avoided or fought for generations because no one understood their behavior. 3 more opportunities, Daniel said, to prove that understanding beats violence. Peter looked out the viewport at the receding asteroid cluster. Do you think they know? The silence bringers, I mean. Do they understand that we're trying? Daniel thought about the gesture the creature had made, lowering its head in response to Peter's show of respect. I think they do. I think they've always been trying to communicate. We just weren't listening. The years accumulated like layers of sediment, each one building on the last until the structure of coalition society had fundamentally changed. Daniel found himself back at the original protected zone, the asteroid field where it all began 8 years ago. He'd requested a solo visit, wanting to see how time had treated both the territory and its guardian. His small observation craft drifted near the boundary markers, now well maintained and understood by both coalition members and the silence bringer that claimed this space. Daniel broadcast the standard greeting frequencies, a pattern that had evolved from Sophie's original research into something approaching a mutual language. Not words exactly, but concepts. Presence, respect, peaceful intent. Movement between the asteroids caught his attention. The silence bringer emerged, and Daniel immediately noticed changes. It was larger somehow, its armor plates darker with age, but more striking were the smaller forms following it. 3 juvenile silence bringers, each about the size of a coalition shuttle, mimicking their parents' movements as they learned to navigate their territory. Daniel felt something catch in his chest. The young ones he'd theorized about 8 years ago had hatched, grown, survived. This wasn't just a creature defending empty space. This was a family thriving under coalition protection, all because one human had chosen to understand rather than fear. The parent creature approached the boundary, and Daniel recognized it by the specific scarring on its forward armor plates. The same individual, It remembered. When it released its subsonic call, the tone was different from that first terrifying roar. Recognition, perhaps even greeting. Daniel's equipment beeped with an incoming transmission. He accepted, and Ambassador Lyra's face appeared on his screen. Her feathers were grayer now, showing her age, but her eyes remained sharp. Director Walsh, I apologize for interrupting your visit, but there's a situation developing that requires your expertise. What kind of situation? A new species has petitioned to join the coalition, the Deepwalkers from the oceanic world of Tethys 9. Their preliminary cultural assessment has revealed something interesting. They have apex predators in their oceans, massive creatures they've lived alongside for their entire evolutionary history. They're claiming they understand predator behavior instinctively. Daniel smiled despite himself. Let me guess. Commander Bront is skeptical? Commander Bront retired 2 years ago, actually. His replacement, Commander Vera, is the one who flagged this as significant. She believes the Deepwalkers might have knowledge that complements human understanding. She's requesting a joint study. The irony wasn't lost on Daniel. Vera, the young scientist who had helped convince the Scaled Assembly to recognize Silence Bringers as sapient, now led their military. Times really had changed. Tell Commander Vera I'd be honored. We should be learning from every species' unique evolutionary path. After the transmission ended, Daniel returned his attention to the Silence Bringer family. The juveniles were playing, if that word applied to their behavior. They chased each other between asteroids, practiced roaring, and tested their strength against smaller rocks. Normal behavior for young predators learning their place in the world. The parent watched them with what Daniel could only interpret as contentment. He thought back to his first encounter, the terror and uncertainty, the desperate hope that his theory was right. Then he thought forward to Peter's success, to the dozens of peaceful contacts that had followed, to the 3 other apex species that had been recognized as sapient rather than destroyed. The ripple effects were still expanding. His communication system chimed again. Sophie this time looking tired but excited. Daniel, you need to see this. We've just translated more of the Silence Bringer subsonic patterns. It's not just emotional communication. There's structure, grammar. They're teaching their young a language. Confirmed sapient communication, Daniel said. Not that we doubted it, but the proof keeps mounting. There's more. We've detected similar patterns from other protected territories. The Silence Bringers are talking to each other across light years. We don't know how yet, but they're maintaining some kind of network. They're not isolated individuals. They're a society. Daniel absorbed that information, its implications branching out in his mind. A society without technology as coalition species understood it. A civilization based on territory, communication, and apparently some form of faster-than-light information exchange that human science couldn't explain yet. Have you shared this with the Council? Scheduled for next week's session. But Daniel, this changes everything again. If they're a networked society, we need formal diplomatic relations, not just protective policies. We need ambassadors, treaties, mutual understanding at a governmental level. One step at a time, Daniel cautioned. We've come far, but pushing too fast could undo that progress. Let the Council absorb the information. Let the Silence Bringers show us how they want to be engaged with. We're still learning their language. After Sophie signed off, Daniel sat in silence, watching the family of massive creatures navigate their asteroid home. The parent noticed him again and moved to the boundary. Then it did something Daniel had never seen before. It released a subsonic pulse, waited, and one of the juveniles approached the boundary as well, mimicking its parent's position. The parent was teaching, showing its young how to interact with the boundaries, how to acknowledge the strange small creatures in their vessels that visited sometimes, teaching the next generation that these beings were not threats, were not prey, were something else, neighbors, maybe friends. Daniel activated his external speakers and broadcast a soft pulse of his own. The juvenile startled but held position, watching its parent for cues. The parent remained calm, so the juvenile settled. Then, hesitantly, the young one lowered its head slightly, copying the gesture its parent had learned 8 years ago. Daniel felt tears in his eyes for the second time in his relationship with these magnificent beings. The gesture was being passed down, knowledge transferred across generations. The Silence Bringers were teaching their children that some creatures, despite being small and strange, deserved respect. He returned the gesture, lowering his head inside his craft. The juvenile watched, learning. The parent rumbled approvingly and led its young back toward the asteroid cluster. The lesson was complete. Daniel set course back to Fortress 7, his mind already working through the implications of everything he'd learned today. The coalition had grown beyond its original charter of mutual defense and trade. It was becoming something deeper. A community of truly diverse minds, each bringing their unique evolutionary wisdom to the whole. Humans had brought their understanding of apex predators and the dance of respect that allowed different dangerous beings to coexist. The Deepwalkers would bring oceanic perspectives humans had never considered. Other species contributed their own insights, shaped by their own paths through evolution. Together, they were building something unprecedented in galactic history. As Fortress 7 grew larger in his viewport, Daniel thought about Ambassador Lyra's words from years ago, that humanity's greatest gift was teaching that strength wasn't the absence of fear, but the ability to face it with respect rather than violence. But that wasn't quite complete. The real gift was showing that every species had something unique to teach, if others were willing to learn. The Silence Bringers taught patience, territory, and the language of presence. The Feathered Crest taught cooperation and seeing patterns from above. The Scaled Assembly taught the importance of remembering history's mistakes. Humans taught predator psychology and the courage to face fear. The Deepwalkers would teach whatever wisdom their oceans had granted them. And there were dozens more species, each with their own lessons. Daniel docked his craft and made his way to the observation deck, a habit from his earliest days on the station. The deck was busier now. Multiple species gathered there, discussing projects, sharing ideas, learning from each other. He spotted Peter training a new group of contact specialists, demonstrating proper approach behaviors. River was there too, teaching a class on overcoming instinctive fear responses. The work continued, expanding, growing. Sophie found him as the station's artificial day cycle moved toward evening. Penny, for your thoughts? Thinking about how far we've come. How far we still have to go. Philosophical mood today? Grateful mood. Daniel gestured at the observation deck's occupants. 8 years ago, I was terrified I'd be wrong. Terrified I'd make things worse. Now look at this. People learning to understand each other despite millions of years of evolutionary divergence. Sophie leaned against the viewport beside him. You started something important, Daniel. But it's bigger than you now. That's a good thing. I know. I just hope we keep moving in the right direction. There's so much we still don't understand. About the Silence Bringers, about ourselves, about how to build a truly inclusive society across species barriers. We'll figure it out. Sophie smiled. One encounter at a time. One gesture of respect at a time. That's all we can do. Later, in his quarters, Daniel recorded his daily log entry. He'd been keeping a journal since that first encounter, documenting not just the facts but his thoughts and feelings. Someday, he hoped it would help future generations understand not just what happened, but why it mattered. Day 2942, he spoke into the recorder. Visited the original protected zone today. The Silence Bringer I first made contact with has successfully raised young. It's teaching them our shared language of respect, passing down knowledge across generations. Sophie's team has confirmed they maintain communication networks across vast distances, suggesting a society more complex than we imagined. The Deepwalkers petition for coalition membership, bringing their own evolutionary wisdom to share. Everything we thought we knew keeps expanding. He paused, gathering his thoughts. I've been thinking about that first day when I stood in the council chamber and tried to explain that the Silence Bringer wasn't a monster. How impossible it seemed that anyone would listen. How desperate I was to make them understand. Now it seems obvious. Of course they're intelligent. Of course they have society and culture and language. Of course they deserve respect. But it wasn't obvious then. Fear made it invisible. That's the real lesson, I think. Not just about Silence Bringers, but about everything. Fear makes us blind. It makes us see threats instead of neighbors. Monsters instead of people, problems instead of opportunities. Every species in the coalition came here afraid of something. We're all still afraid, but we're learning to see past that fear to what's actually there, learning to ask why before we assume the worst. The creature roared at all, as the old report said. But it wasn't rage or hatred. It was communication in the only language it knew, and when someone finally spoke that language back, when someone showed understanding instead of fear, it lowered its head in silence, not in defeat, not in submission, but in recognition of a kindred soul who was trying to understand. That's what we're all trying to do across all our differences. Understand each other, respect each other, build something together that none of us could build alone. It's hard work. It's scary sometimes, but looking at that parent teaching its young today, seeing knowledge passed down that will shape the next generation, I know it's worth it. Daniel stopped the recording and looked out his window at the stars. Somewhere out there, silence bringers drifted through space, raising families, maintaining their networks, living lives humans were only beginning to understand. Somewhere, the deepwalkers swam in their vast oceans, preparing to share their wisdom with a galactic community. Somewhere, the next challenge waited, the next opportunity to choose understanding over fear. He'd spent 8 years learning the language of apex predators. He'd spent however many remained, learning the languages of everyone else. Because that was what this moment in history required. Not warriors or conquerors, but translators, bridge builders, people willing to face their fears and find the understanding waiting on the other side. The creature had roared it all, fierce and terrible in its power, yet before the human it lowered its head in silence. And in that silence everything changed.